Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Picnic at Hanging Rock. This film came out in 1975. It was directed by Peter Weir. This was early on in Peter Weir's career, and it is when I think he's at his most imaginative, his most experimental perhaps. And I don't know, I feel like with his movies, they all feel very introverted in a way. They feel like very personal experiences even when they take place on a grand scale. Even a film like this, like it feels very intimate, it feels very introverted, and yet it's just full of so many things. It's full of ambition, I think, as a creative experience, and it's very deceptive, I think. It really opens up slowly like a flower that is very intoxicating and very hypnotic in a way, kaleidoscopic, I guess you could say. But there's always kind of the thorns underneath it that will slowly reveal themselves. And that's just what I felt instantly from the first frame. This movie is, you know, say what you will about it, but it is very, very confident in its style. And this is a very famous Australian film that marked a turning point. It was kind of the beginning of the Australian New Wave in the late 70s. And I think this is going to be one of those movies that it either is really going to appeal to you or it's really not going to appeal to you at all. It's a movie that is very quiet, but the silence is very, very loud. So much of this is about what is unspoken, and everything I think is dealt with in implication for the most part. It's about capturing an essence, like an atmosphere, a romanticism with a tinge of that bitterness, you know, like the thorns that I mentioned before in contrast. This is a movie that takes the stance of sometimes there is no reason why things happen. And yet this feeling of fate weighs very heavily on these characters. And it's certainly, I felt it, you know, just watching the movie. And, you know, there are no easy threads that are going to build a satisfying conclusion there. I found myself, when I first saw the film, I thought, okay, I need to instantly go back and watch it because I'm sure there's some sort of key here. There's something that I'm missing. But actually, when I go back and watch the film, I find myself having even more questions than I did initially. So this is a movie where you're going to leave with maybe more questions than you have answers to. But it's also very, very meticulous in terms of what it's doing to kind of guide you on this journey because you know, they're deliberately dropping clues that are meant to subvert your expectations. Just these purposeful kind of red herrings planted all the way through that make you think that you're being guided into, you know, finding something that really takes a shape, some sort of antagonistic force, and yet it never comes to fruition. And I think this is the type of thing that is very, very hard to pull off from an artistic standpoint for a director. Because so many of our stories are built on processes and payoffs. And you know, not all of them succeed, but for me, this one absolutely did. This is one of those movies where I just knew right away that this is a movie for me, and this is a movie that I'm really, really going to be entranced by. I think part of why I like it is there's a lot of movies that are very interested in aesthetic, but this one, the aesthetic, it feels like it is fully thought through. They spent a lot of time thinking about what these characters would feel, what they would do. Just the littlest things are all here. The thumbprints of a life are all over this movie. It fully commits to the look, and it's extremely cohesive aesthetically, visually, emotionally. Just the feeling throughout the movie of this immensity of space weighing on every little thing that we do, knowing that the earth is so much bigger than us, and yet we don't realize all the time how precious life is. We often live our lives as if we're not going to die, which is why I like the idea of the movie taking place at a school where you have these young ladies who are, you know, right on the cusp of womanhood. This film is, I think, bone-chilling because it has something very floral and romantic and lush about it, yet it's contrasted with this horror and this sort of like hazy new age 1970s sort of style and a dash of the psychedelic sizzling in there as well. But I think this movie is just stunning. It's absolutely stunning, and you can see where, especially somebody like Sofia Coppola, you can see where she got her influence absolutely in terms of her look. It's really fetishizing surfaces here, but again, it all has a point. It doesn't feel like, you know, it's just frou-frou embellishments for the sake of being embellishments. The fetishization is very important because not only is it a story about girls, especially girls whose lives are cut short, we assume, but it's also a film that's dealing with the voyeurism, you know, the way women are perceived in certain ways. So a lot of the images, you know, they've got to be, You know, they can be a little bit innocent, but also not quite. So the mix of the soft and perhaps the dangerous, I think, is a very important, or it's very crucial, I think, to the central power of the movie. And I like that the girls are, you know, they are very soft and very like ethereal, very, you know, it's just very feminine. The film is when it's focusing on them. You feel almost like an admiration for them, of course, a romanticism, but there's a disconnect at the same time where there's something just always a little bit off. The film is very delicate looking, lots of pastels, and it's kind of a touch of the Rococo flair as well. And a lot of these, like the look of the film, a lot of times it looks like paintings. Like these images that are very sumptuous and like all perfect. It's very much like depicting high society in a very elegant way. But yet always there is a feeling that these girls and everything being so soft and lovely, it's begging to be fucked with. Like you can just feel it always. Because these delicate flowers, these young girls that are in this very structured, civilized world where they have a very specific set of rules, but you know, they are right on the cusp of the wild. They are in Australia, one of the most naturalistic places on Earth, a place that is not touched as much by civilization as maybe other places in the world. And I just think that's so important to the movie. This movie is all about chaos versus structure. Always you feel just like a push and a pull there. I just love the structure of the school, like the columns and everything having a very specific look. Again, that's like meant to be civilized order. And then everything outside is just like, everything is breathing practically. There's animals, like wild animals all around them. And you can just feel almost like a lethargic haze taking over the movie, especially as they're climbing that rock. Also a key, I think, is there are sparks of real genuine honesty and beauty in this world. You always see like a spark of youth captured in these girls. They very much feel like fun, playful girls that are excited to rebel, you know, very much like anyone would today. It's not all just proper behavior. They're teenagers, you know, there's sensuality and there's a modern quality to everything for sure, because I think this film is really emphasizing time, how it slips away from us, but also there's an absence of the feeling of time. But in the opening, as these girls are slowly starting to remove their layers as they go up this rock, it's one of my favorite things in the movie, just watching society slowly get left behind, and you are at the mercy of the earth, which can swallow you, you know, and not care. No one will know you're gone. It's very beguiling. The whole sequence reminds me a lot of like Aguirre, the Wrath of God, and even just the music and everything with like the pan flute. It doesn't mix with this, again, these English girls. So it's all very unsettling, but there's this mysticism and this intrigue to it. Beautiful, but also very dangerous. But what a hallucinogenic power this movie has. Really, like when I'm watching these girls, they look like they're tripping their balls off. It's like a mushroom sort of experience. And I like that they use that almost like you get this feeling as they're climbing, there's a release, and it can be a release of, you know, whatever. It can be like a sexual release, you know, a release of just like the corsets as an example is like a very literal example of that. But what happened to the girls, of course, is the big question. We don't know. Is it God, or is the rock supposed to be like this metaphor for God kind of towering over them and reminding them that they have no control over their own existence, and he can pluck them from existence whenever he pleases. And I think as they disappear into the side of the rock, that's just like, you know, that's a huge turning point in the movie. And anybody that makes it out, there's a change to them. Like Irma as an example. When she comes back, she's very different, and she's removed. It's almost as if she's lost her innocence on that rock. And there's really no consistent idea, no consistent metaphors or anything that tie the disappearances together. And there's no real consistency in terms of we really know what's in there. It's like, you know, you get little hints of like, was there a rape? Was there some sort of violent something? But it's like, you know, we don't know. And I think the disappearance of the teacher, Miss McGraw, you know, like that's an example of that complicates it, because if she weren't there, then it would be a very different story. Or I should say if she hadn't disappeared as well, because she's very different from the other girls. She looks very different. She's wearing all dark colors and the girls are all very, you know, pure and very white, but she's very rigid and very cold, and she has this like all-knowing sort of perceptive quality to her in the way that she speaks. She's very conscious of like, we are very small and very insignificant on this earth. She has this feeling as she speaks, in contrast to the girls who are, they're girls. They're very like, the world revolves around me. They're just naive, to the dangers of the unknown. And perhaps this woman, is more experienced than that. Yet it's interesting that she's the one, even though we don't see what happens to her, you get a sense that she was perhaps lost it the most, or she became the most hysterical. So, there's just no real explanation. And that's the sad thing. That's the cruel thing about life. Why do certain things happen? Why do certain things feel so coincidental at times when other things don't? Why is nature so cruel? Why can it just swallow you whole and that's it? You're never heard from again, and the world just moves on. And Hanging Rock is a volcano. So it's like whatever's happening in there, whatever the shapeless antagonist is, it's a turbulent beast. And it could be, a metaphor for like sexual liberation or violence, wild, intoxicating, terrifying things. Maybe it's like DMT, where each person kind of faces their own death, their own ego in a certain way. Again, I don't know what any of it is. All I know is it's a very trippy feeling, and it feels like you're facing these primitive roots of this animalism, facing death and peering into the void when we rarely do. I reviewed the Blair Witch Project sometime during Halloween last year, and I talked about the fear in that film, fear of the unknown, and why it's so effective. And I think it's because of the way fear is manifested, and just the way that it's manipulated. And just the idea that there's almost, to me, nothing more terrifying than existing one moment, and then the next you're gone, and there's no explanation. No one can find you. Loved ones look and look and look, and you're just gone. Because nature is brutal, and nature doesn't care. And I think that movie really expresses that in a very simple but very effective way. And I think that, like in this movie, there's a similarity to the sense that people that are young, they romanticize everything, but we also romanticize youth ourselves. We attach a sense of idealism to these young girls because they are the future. When a young person dies, when somebody's life is cut off short like that, you think, oh, but they had so much to look forward to in their life. There's something even very romantic about that, which is very strange to say, but just like, in terms of a very compelling story, the idea of life being taken too soon, and we see it all the time. Like I can think of like JonBenet Ramsey, like this pretty little girl who's brutally killed and no one ever found a reason why. Even Gabby Petito, that's like, I'm thinking of like a recent story that captured like the American consciousness for a bit, and that's it. Obviously we know what happened now for the most part, but just like the image of this blonde, 21, 22-year-old girl, like this image of radiance and sunshine, and it is crushed. That's something that can be very enticing to people. And I look at Miranda in the movie as an example, like a symbol, a sort of like a JonBenet Ramsey or a Gabby Petito. She's maybe the most obvious central emblem here that has to do with the point of romanticism. She is that Gabby Petito image that can be very glorified in pop culture, a symbol of like fresh snow with bloody tracks, which is a very voyeuristic image and something I think that people latch onto. And I like the idea, or I like the fact that this film very much is a study in voyeurism as well, and the way we latch on to these images of people who are gone. I can think about like Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks. It's so similar, that idea of like just like the prom queen, like this beautiful blonde girl, and then she's brutally killed in some way. And obviously at the beginning of that show, that's the focus, is who killed Laura. And as the show goes on, it becomes less and less about that. And this film too, it starts to become less and less about finding the girls, because after a while there is loss of hope, naturally. But how do we cope with that? I think this movie is very much about dealing with the aftermath of loss. And when things happen that we can't make sense of, how do we move on in a society where everything is supposed to be structured and make sense? Reality has to carry forward, and yet you have these emotions within you that often don't leave you. Often like sensory emotions, really immediate emotions and memories feel like, they happened yesterday, but maybe they happened 40 years ago. And so that's very painful when you have to continue to build this box around yourself, this box that restricts you, while ghosts continue to haunt your dreams. And so we grow bitter while that pain is never ever going away. So that pain reverberates and affects others around you in different ways. And there's an emptiness that reflects our own fears, knowing that one day the same thing will happen to us as well. No one's making it out of this world alive. But I think for me, it's Sarah and Mrs. Appleyard that are able to carry the movie forward and bring everything to a conclusion that for me is satisfying, because they kind of carry that aftermath and the symbolism of that aftermath. Now, is the movie too ambiguous? I think it's definitely accused of that, and maybe it is. I can certainly see people arguing that point, talking about maybe the thinness of it, and you can maybe argue that the antagonistic forces may be a little bit too ambiguous, or that things are too reliant on more abstract metaphors. And yet for me, even though there's nothing very literal about it, I think that shapeless antagonist is a really solid sort of structure and a focus. It's just more like a Rorschach test, I think. And it represents this strong concept of all these mysteries of the world and time and all of that locked up. And very few of us will ever see it unless we're about to die. And the possibility of that, and knowing one day it will happen to us, that's going to affect those who remain on Earth still. When I look at Mrs. Appleyard, I find her to be a really tragic character. Now, she's somebody that's very unlikable, don't get me wrong, because she's, a total dragon lady to these girls. And yet she's a woman who has certain responsibilities. She's somebody who's very comfortable with order because, of course, she's lived in a certain society. But she also has to fight to maintain that order because it is her job. It is her job to keep these girls safe and educate them, all of those things. And so I think, if you were in a situation like she was in and you started losing your pupils in that way, it would be very, very hard. And many of the things that happen, you can't necessarily blame her for. You can certainly blame the way she handles it. I certainly would. But in terms of what happens, it's just, unfortunately, the nature of things. All things do come to an end. But it's how we handle it, I think, that can certainly change things. I am just in love with this movie. I am so in love with it. Just the idea of one thing changing your life forever that stays branded in your memory because it was really beautiful or really terrifying, maybe insignificant, who knows, but yet it stays with you forever while you slowly age and become more isolated and stagnant with time. I don't know, it's devastating, it's chilling, it's intriguing, it's beautiful. This movie is like being in some old abandoned house that no one has lived in for decades, and just like the thickness of the air says everything about its history. It's like you can just hear the whispers of the people who used to live there. And somehow in that moment, the past and the present are blending into one. And this film just conveys it in an extraordinary way. If you like a movie like House of Tolerance, I absolutely recommend Picnic at Hanging Rock, because that's a similar portrait of women at the very beginning of the 20th century, and like the sexuality and the hysteria, the melancholy, all blooming at once in this portrait of women, yet they're ultimately still trumped by society's expectations and the choices that they make within that society. The time periods in which we live affect our personalities and our choices far more than people will ever realize. And if you love a movie like Virgin Suicides, then yes, watch Picnic at Hanging Rock, because you'll see where a lot of those influences originally came from. Like that, like I said, that hazy new wave vision of femininity. It is beguiling, it is haunting. I just adore this film. Please see it. And that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website. As always, it is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist and I do commissioned portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below. Also, I want to give a shout out to my patrons who have been wonderful. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you're interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.